Today we're going to talk about architecture, and specifically about a man who's been called the pioneer of modern architecture. His name is Frank Lloyd Wright, and I expect some of you at least have heard of him. Maybe not all, but I think some. This is a quote that Wright said in 1957. He said, "The mission of an architect is to help people understand how to make life more beautiful, the world a better one for living in, and to give reason, rhyme, and meaning to life." To develop an understanding of Wright's life and work, I read 2 books and then quite a few reviews and articles. I used all of that to develop this program. It turns out that occasionally there are discrepancies, there are disagreements in dates, and in some cases in names. And so what I've done is I've chosen the ones that made the most sense and or were the ones that were most often mentioned. So with that understanding, let's see what we've got. The 2 books that I picked, the first one was written by Frank Lloyd Wright himself. It's called an autobiography. He published it posthumously, of course, in 2005. You see the little red square on the book? That's sort of his totem, his logo. He put that everywhere that he was putting his name as well. This book is a good book, but it's empty in some important places. Remember, we've talked about biographies before and autobiographies. And certainly there are times when you're telling your own story, you might not want to put everything in that a straight biographer would. The other book that I chose was this one, Frank Lloyd Wright, a biography by Merrill Seacrest. It was published in 1992. And I'll tell you, between the 2 of those, I would read them both. If I could only read one, I believe I would read Seacrest if I was interested in a lot of historical fact, because she's looking at everything and she doesn't have any blinders. If you want to just get something of the spirit of the man, then I would read his autobiography, because he does have on blinders and he comes out as a really cool guy, and I think you'll enjoy it. The additional things that I had to go to, though, the additional articles, reviews, and so forth that I used as background are these. This one, this is a list of them, and I recommend all of them to you, especially the first one. It's an article by author Lloyd. It was printed in the Smithsonian Magazine in 2009, and it's called The Triumph of Frank Lloyd Wright. It's probably the best overview of his entire career of any that I found. In addition, the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation was a great source. Britannica is a great source. There's an article by Elizabeth Stamp that came out in 2020 in Architectural Digest, and it was Inside Frank Lloyd Wright's Astounding Legacy. She also looks at his career as a whole, and it's excellent. Then the Victoria and Albert Museum have a nice section on Frank Lloyd Wright. And then finally, I used Vicki Hallett's article from the National Geographic magazine, published in 2022, and it's called Why Frank Lloyd Wright's Playful Architecture Fuels Creativity. I recommend them all to you. I think you'll enjoy them. So let's get going. Let's find out what made Frank Lloyd Wright tick. This is a picture of him as a child. He was born in 1867. So he's born in the Victorian era, and he dies in 1959, which many would say was the beginning or close to the beginning of the modern era. What I found from my reading and my research was that Wright, even as a child, was a very complicated person. He was a genius at his work. Turns out he was just average to poor as a student. And also found out that his life was filled with lots of surprises, and sometimes those surprises even surprised him. Let's take a look at his parents because they're a key to understanding him. He, first of all, was born Frank Lincoln Wright, not Frank Lloyd Wright. More about that later. He was born on June 8th, 1867 in Richland Center, Wisconsin. And Wisconsin will be, for his entire life, his home base. His dad was William Carey Wright, a preacher and a musician, but not necessarily in that order. His mother was Anna Lloyd Jones, a teacher from a large, prominent Welsh family. They'd come from Wales and they had settled the valley near Spring Green, Wisconsin. Again, this is home base for Frank Lloyd Wright. Lebeau, in his article, writes, Wright's father, William, was a restless, chronically dissatisfied Protestant minister and organist who moved his family, which included Wright's two younger sisters, from town to town until he eventually obtained a divorce in 1885 and took off for good. Wright, who was 17 when his father left, never saw his father again. And that trauma impacted everything else about the man's life until his death. This is a picture of his father, William Russell Carey Wright, quite a distinguished gentleman. Wright's childhood was spent on the move. They lived in Rhode Island, they lived in Iowa, they lived in Massachusetts, and they eventually settled near Madison, Wisconsin. That happened when Wright was 11 years old. It was 1878. Now, during all that moving between the time of his birth until he's 11, he's homeschooled. Scholars suggest that Wright's father left his family because he felt they weren't living up to the precepts that he was teaching from the pulpit every Sunday. Although Wright never saw his father again, his father left him with invaluable knowledge that was critical to his architecture. This is a picture of Unity Temple. It was built between 1906 and 1908, and it was for the Unitarian Church in Oak Park, which is a beautiful area of Chicago. Unity Temple is considered Wright's greatest public building during his early period, which they call the Prairie period. It's the only surviving building from this early part of Wright's career. His father could play 11 other instruments other than the organ. He taught his son to play the piano, the violin, and the cello. In the process, his father taught Wright about the importance of acoustics and the way in which sound vibrates off walls. Throughout his career, Wright designed a number of churches and other buildings in which he incorporated great acoustics. Unity Temple was one of those. This is Anna Lloyd Jones. This is his mother. She's the most important figure in his life. His mother was determined that Wright would be a great builder. And so she even decorated his nursery with photographs and pictures of the great cathedrals of the world as inspiration. The other thing she did was she bought these, the Friedrich Froebel blocks, and I expect some of you have seen these before, maybe played with them. She homeschooled him from kindergarten on. Even after they moved to Wisconsin and he went into a regular classroom, she continued to homeschool him. She purchased a set of these blocks that had been created by Froebel, who was the founder of the first kindergarten. These were geometrically shaped blocks in different sizes that the child could assemble in different combinations to create a three-dimensional object. Interestingly, many of Wright's buildings have been cited for showing their geometrical clarity and their aesthetic simplicity. Who knows, the blocks may have done it. Lebeau, in 2009, wrote his, meaning Wright's mother's family, the combative Lloyd Joneses, were Welsh immigrants who became prominent citizens of an agriculture valley near the village of Hillside, Wisconsin. Wright himself might have written the family motto, which was truth against the world. In 1985, his parents divorced, and at that point, Wright changed his middle name to Lloyd. He took away Lincoln, he added Lloyd, and he did that to honor his mother and his mother's family name. The finances had always been strained during the marriage, and they became even more strained after the marriage. And Wright took a job at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's Department of Engineering while taking some classes there. This man is known as the father of modernism, or the father of skyscrapers. He's Lewis Henry Sullivan from 1856 to 1924. If you know Sullivan, then you're some of those out there who know something about architecture. In 1887, Wright left Madison, Wisconsin, and he went to Chicago. He was going to pursue his dream and his mother's dream that he become an architect. He found work in several small firms before he was hired by Adler and Sullivan, a very important firm in Chicago. At Adler and Sullivan, Frank reported directly to architect Louis Sullivan. He did that for 6 years, and it was an amazing tutorial for this young and upcoming architect. LeBeau writes, encouraged by his maternal relatives, Wright showed an early aptitude for architecture. He made his initial forays into building design by working on a chapel, a school, and 2 houses in Hillside before he went to Chicago and began his apprenticeship with Louis Sullivan. Sullivan's specialty was office buildings, public buildings, including classic skyscrapers, which were beginning to mark the landscape. Wright didn't care for that. He wanted to focus on residential buildings, homes, and so that's where he focused his energy. Now that Wright was gainfully employed in a career that he had longed for and that his mother had insisted on, he decided it was time that he start a family. So he started looking. He married Catherine Lee Kitty Tobin in 1889. He was 22 and she was 17. His mother strongly objected and was a problem for Kitty throughout this marriage. Kitty was a socialite, well known in Chicago, well placed in Chicago, and she also was a trained social worker. They had 6 children together. Wright gave Kitty the first Oak Park home that he built as a wedding present. He ultimately designed 25 homes in this exclusive area of Chicago, and they're gorgeous. This is a picture of the first house. This is the one that he gave Kitty, but this is not the way it looked when he gave it to her. He added and redid, put a studio on it, put a playroom in it for those 6 children. So this is as it looked toward the end. To finance the building of that house, Wright entered into a 5-year exclusive contract with Louis Sullivan. The home featured a riff, really, on the East Coast shingle style, and it's got a very prominent roof gable, as you can see. Wright would add to it for over a decade. His love for beautiful things got Wright in so much trouble. He would see something pretty and he would just buy it. He didn't know whether he had money for it. He didn't care about money. His father hadn't either, so this was coming down the line. He began, because of the financial distress he had put himself in, he began taking independent residential commissions, which was, of course, a direct violation to his contract with Louis Sullivan. He left the firm, whether by being fired or by just resigning. Anyway, he left the firm and he opened his own office, and from that point on, he was independent. It would be nearly 20 years before he and Sullivan would reconcile, but they did eventually. This is the William Winslow House. I think it's a rather elegant house. It's simple. It's Wright's first independent commission. It features a broad roof, as you can see, and over 16 years, Wright's primary goal was to create an indigenous American architecture. People were building homes, but they were building homes in the style of the houses that their forebears had been in other countries. So there were a lot of English houses and a lot of, in some places, French houses. He wanted something that spoke to America. And by doing so, he set some standards for these residences that he was designing. And because they were so good and so well appreciated by the architects and the buyers, it became known as the Prairie style. It reflected in Wright's mind the long, low, horizontal prairie landscape that he wanted his houses to be in. They had low-pitched roofs, very deep overhangs, no attics or basements, of course, and long rows of windows that emphasize the horizontal line. If you look at the Winslow house, the overhang creates a shadow, but if you look carefully into that shadow, you see the line of windows that he's put there. LeBeau wrote this: low-slung, earth-hugging buildings with strong horizontal lines and open circulation through the public rooms. See, this is his description of what these houses are like. They were stripped clean of unnecessary decoration and used machine-made components. Let me stop a minute on this one. Machine-made components were the exact opposite of what fine houses had in them in the day. The fine houses had beautiful antiques, beautiful handcrafted pieces of furniture. Wright went in the other direction. In fact, he designed a lot of furniture that could just be manufactured. He preferred that, and he thought that the modern family would appreciate that, especially if the modern family couldn't afford a lovely antique. LeBeau continues, the Prairie style revolutionized home design by responding to the domestic needs and tastes of modern families. Just like his father before him, his father left the family with children at home. Wright, even with 6 children at home, he was growing more and more ambivalent about family life. In autobiography, he writes, I hated the sound of the word Papa. Things were not looking good for Kitty. In 1909, he just leaves her. He left her, he left the children, he left his practice, and off to Europe he goes. Mema Cheney, a client he had met while he was working on a house for her and her husband, had had a quiet affair for, several years with Wright. Mema left her husband and joined Wright in Europe, and she remained in Germany for a number of years. Scholars have had a field day with this because, of course, Wright's having been abandoned by his father, and now he's repeating history. He's abandoning his own children. Mema and Wright spent some time in Europe together. Her divorce was moving forward. The funny thing is that the press got a hold of it and created quite the scandal for Wright and for Mema. As a result, it gave Kitty more ammunition not to give him a divorce, and so it was a full 14 years before she did finally let him have a divorce. In 1910, apparently he felt a little bit of guilt about leaving the family and her, and so he tried to reconcile with Kitty. It was an abysmal failure. This is Taliesin. It's technically Taliesin number 1. 1911, Wright began building it. It was a future home for Mema, for himself, and for Mema's children. It's built in the Wisconsin Valley where the Welsh Lloyd Joneses had originally settled. Taliesin is a Welsh word. It means shining brow. and he places his house so that it appears to be almost a brow on the hill that it's on. It's the name also of a famous 6th century Welsh poet. Wright named his house Taliesin to honor his mother's family's Welsh roots. So once again, he's now Lloyd Wright, and his house is honoring the Wales background. Taliesin was a rambling, as you can see, very rambling dwelling. It was made of local limestone. Wright always used local materials where he possibly could. It's the culmination of his prairie-style period. It's a big house with long roofs extending over the walls, and it seems to rise up from the earth. Just when Wright was feeling truly happy again, an unbelievable tragedy struck. In 1914, Maman, her 2 children, and 4 others who were part of the work crew staying on the site were killed in a fire that was started by a manservant, a Taliesin. The home was completely destroyed, and in many ways, Wright was too. The only way he knew how to cope with emotional distress was to work. So he immediately began rebuilding Taliesin, calling it Taliesin II. And he did it in Maman's memory. It was mostly in ruins, and he really didn't recover emotionally. His son with Kitty, John, wrote in a memoir some years later, "Something in him died with her, something lovable and gentle." Wright left Taliesin for a decade as he worked in Tokyo. In 1913 or 1914, again, the dates are conflicting, he received an important international commission to design the new Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. This is an antique postcard that shows the Imperial as he designed it. The hotel, after he completed it, welcomed guests for 40 years until it was torn down so a high-rise building could be put in its place. I don't forgive them for this. Wright combined Eastern architecture with Western architecture to symbolize that Japan was now a gateway to both. Now, this is a photograph much like the one that was used for the postcard, but it gives you a little clearer view of what the hotel looked like. It has a courtyard in the center with a pond, and then the guest rooms are on either side, and then the building you're looking at straight ahead, that's the public part. That's where the dining is done, that's where the banquet hall is, the ballroom is, those kinds of activities take place there. Wright designed a total of 14 buildings for Japan, and this one is the best known. Japan is the only country outside of America that Wright lived and worked in. His recovery from the trauma was eased because he had thrown himself into work. He also had always loved and really been intrigued by the Japanese culture. And so he enjoyed living there while he was designing and building structures. And he nearly went bankrupt again because he was buying all the pretty things that he saw. Sadly, Wright's life was about to get very complicated. While he was rebuilding Taliesin, now Taliesin II, Wright was literally seduced by Maud Miriam Noel. She was a wealthy divorcee. She was a sculptress until Wright forbade her from doing sculpture anymore because he thought it was unseemly. She was also a morphine addict, which was not that uncommon during this time period because morphine and opium and all those other things were considered medicinal products. And she was a spiritualist, which made her a little different too. The two remained lovers until Kitty and Wright finally got their divorce in 1923. Wright delayed marrying Noel for a full year. I suspect he had some misgivings. He should have had more misgivings. But he went ahead and married her. And the reason Kitty gave him the divorce in 23 was she'd had it kind of up to here because he had these women and he obviously was not going to come back to her. They married that year after the divorce was final, but within 5 to 6 months, Noel had left Wright. They were separated for 2 years before they began the divorce proceedings. Wright wrote later that the relationship was toxic. He referred to it not as a marriage or a love match. He referred to it as an entanglement. They engaged in what has been described as, quote, an extended, positively gruesome divorce and legal battle that dragged on 4 years. In 1924, Wright met Olga Lazarevich, a dancer from Montenegro who was about to be divorced herself. They started seeing each other and they fell in love. She was the daughter of the Chief Justice of Montenegro. She was educated in Russia, and she was 30 years younger than Wright. As it turns out, Wright, who was so good with architecture and so lousy with love, finally got it right. In 1925, Olga moved to Taliesin II. Early in that year, she became pregnant with their child, and she bore Wright a daughter, Iovana. Because of a lightning strike, Taliesin II burned to the ground. The fire happened the same night that Olga told Wright that they were expecting a child. In 1928, Wright married Olga, and she proved to be a great partner for him. She helped him resume his work on what he called the cause of architecture, that he had started years before but somehow never could get really into. They were married until his death in 1959, and by all accounts, it was a very happy marriage. In 1932, at Olga's insistence and with her help, he published 2 important works, an autobiography, which you already know, and a second work called The Disappearing City. Both introduced Wright to a larger national audience than he had ever reached before. An autobiography received widespread critical acclaim, and it's still included in architectural schools as a required reading for generations of young architects. The Disappearing City, though, was not taken seriously at the time. Very low sales, people didn't know what he was talking about. However, decades later, and for decades beyond that, the Disappearing City would influence community developments all over, not just America, but worldwide. It describes Wright's special vision for what he called Broadacre City. It was a city that had been decentralized and moved from the city to the country. In other words, it's an embracing of the rural life. You know what he did? He rebuilt Taliesin III. Again, Taliesin III, here's the picture of it. And you see this is a little larger than the Taliesin II. He built it, named it Taliesin III, and he enlarged it because he and Olga wanted to start a school of architecture so he could teach. It became their home, together with his stepdaughter, Svetlana, and their daughter, Iovana. In 1932, Wright and Olga established an architectural school at Taliesin III, and they named it the Taliesin Fellowship. It offered fellowships to apprentices who could appreciate a total learning environment, echoes of his mother, and homeschooling. They integrated architecture, construction, farming, gardening, cooking, nature studies, music, art, and dance. LeBeau writes, by 1932, Wright had been a force in American architecture for more than 3 decades and was devoting most of his time to giving lectures and publishing essays. It was easy to believe that his best years were behind him. but in fact, many of his most heralded works were still to come. In 1936, he and Olga made a joint decision, but it was primarily based on Wright's age and deteriorating health. Wisconsin's very cold in the winter, and he started developing pneumonias in the winter, and Olga was worried. They rented some space in Arizona where the fellowship was relocated. They took their students with them, and they worked on building a house that Wright had designed, and when it was finished, they named it Taliesin West. This is a picture of it. I think of all the Taliesin's, this one is the prettiest. Confession here, I'm not, a real fan of modern art, but I have learned that what Wright did, it's modern art. There is a beauty to it that I don't see in all of the modern art structures. The next year, after they'd moved down there, then he officially made Taliesin West his winter home and his studio in the desert, and he used that place until he died in 1959. It's built in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the foothills of the McDowell Mountains. As was his pattern for all of his own homes, he continually renovated and added to it until his death. His homes became, you see, his workshops where he could try out an idea to see what it would look like in real time as opposed to being drawn out. He was always a firm advocate of residing and working at the same place. He said it avoided the distractions of trying to fight traffic to get to the studio and other stresses that would have taken time from his work. One of Wright's most famous homes is Falling Water. As I said before, I don't care for modern architecture, but I love this house. This is a beautiful, beautiful residence. It was commissioned by the Kaufman family. They made their fortune with Kaufman department stores, I think that began in Pittsburgh. And their commission was this. They wanted Wright to build them, quote, a weekend cottage in the countryside near a beautiful waterfall in a ravine called Bear Run in Collinsville, Pennsylvania. Kaufman also specified that they wanted that little cottage to be sited on the opposite side of Bear Run so that they could look up from their home up at the waterfall. That was not what Wright had in mind. Meryl Seacrest, in this book, the biography, does a really superb job of explaining the evolution of what the Kaufmans wanted and what Wright delivered. She quotes Wright it's his comment when he sees the location for the first time. He said, quote, "There's a beautiful forest. There in a beautiful forest was a solid, high rock ledge rising beside a waterfall. And the natural thing seemed to be to cantilever the house from that rock bank over the falling water." So that's what he decided to do. He had the habit, when he was given a commission, to put nothing on paper, sometimes for a year or longer. He's thinking. He'll go back and look at the site again, and he did. And then he'll think some more. And until he's pressed, he's really not completely ready to design the house. It took him just over 2 hours to draw Falling Water from scratch. And the reason we know this is because Kaufman called and said he would be there at the end of the week to see his house plans. So Wright had to put something on paper, and Wright allowed his associates, this stable of architects who worked for him, to be with him to watch while he drew this thing out. When Kaufman came and saw the plans, he said, "Don't change a thing." Lebeau writes, "The cantilevering that he had employed for the exaggeratedly horizontal roofs of the prairie-style houses assumed a new grandeur in Falling Water. which Wright composed of broad plains of concrete terraces and flat roofs, and in a stroke of panache, he perched over a waterfall in western Pennsylvania. I'm going to show you an interior picture from Falling Water. This is the main room. He called it the grand room. Others refer to it as the living room, but it's Wright's grand room. It's 35 by 45 feet. It was the one thing that Kaufman asked for that Wright gave him, but he gave it to him in a much better form than Kaufman was thinking. It has views in all directions, and you can see that the glass goes up, forming the walls. He built Falling Water as a series of reinforced concrete trays, which are supported by piers, and then they're anchored with a central masonry core. The chimney was made of local stone, laid rough. The floors were of quarried stone, and a rocky outcropping from that ledge that Wright cantilevered the house from was actually incorporated into the fireplace hearth. He didn't cut it off and put it in the house. He built the house around it. This is the view of Falling Water that you would get if you drove up to the house. And this is in the parking area. And you can see it has a little bit different line this way, but still very elegant and very much a part of its surroundings. Kaufman gave Wright an absolute budget, no more than $35,000. And Falling Water cost $85,000 when it was finished. But that was because, as Wright built it, he would show Kaufman an alternative to the original plan, not of the structure, but of something to do with the kind of interior look. And Kaufman would go for it, so it cost him another $50,000. Scholars have noted that the name of the house, Falling Water, was given to it by Wright, and that it's the only structure that Wright ever built that incorporated his personal signature in the name. You see here FLLW, and then the name of the house, Falling Water, with the letters emphasized. Wright's favorite way of signing his initials is seen at the top, and below you see the embedded initials. You can find this FLLW on all of his papers, on his plans. If he were initialing something, it always had the double L. His friends, fellow architects, would refer to him in writing as FLLW. Falling Water has better stood the test of time aesthetically than physically. In 2003, it had to have an $11.5 million renovation. This was to correct some sagging in the cantilevers, leaking roofs, leaking terraces, and interior mildew infestation. Sechrist, in her biography of Wright, has this to say: Falling Water was a stunning synthesis of all Wright thought and believed, and spectacular proof that at the age of 68, when most men are looking for retirement, Wright was launching himself on the final great phase of his astonishing career. This picture is my favorite of Falling Water. If you notice the detail, he's even included a staircase down to a little platform right above the waterfall, but close enough so that you can sit on that platform and wiggle your toes in the cool water. I think it's absolutely beautiful. And again, it's another look at this spectacular home. Wright entered his period of greatest productivity when he was in his 80s. You see him here, he's at work. He liked to draw at tables standing up. He was not a sitter, he was a stander. And you see around him in his workshop the tables where his other architects would have been drawing and doing as well. This is Jacob's house. It's Wright's first Usonian house. This is a form of housing that he designed I had never heard of until I did the research here. 1937, Wright wanted to provide affordable, individualized homes that would meet the need of middle-class Americans. So he began designing what he called Usonian houses, United States of North America houses. He positioned them so as to capture the winter sun for passive solar heating, and he outfitted them with eaves to provide summer shade. They were constructed with glass, brick, and wood, so you didn't have to have any decoration on them. They were lit by windows underneath the overhang on the roofline, and they had built-in electric features. They were shielded from the street to avoid privacy. And he included an open carport to accommodate the transportation that he believed middle Americans would be using. Wright said in 1938, "I don't build a house without predicting the end of the present social order. Every building is a missionary." Think about that. Every building he's telling us what the future is going to be as he designs it. What then is Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy? LeBeau says this: Wright pioneered trends that other architects would later embrace. Passive solar heating, open plan offices, multi-storied hotel atriums, all are now common, but at the time Wright designed them, they were revolutionary. He continues, a Wright house contained, along with private bedrooms and baths, an emphasis on unbroken communal spaces, a living room that flowed into a kitchen, for example, unknown in domestic residences when he began his practice in the Victorian era. This picture, I wish I had seen this building before, but I've never been to Manhattan, so I haven't seen it. Even as falling water is considered by most to be Wright's finest achievement in residential design, most also agree that the Guggenheim Museum of Modern Art in Manhattan is his finest public building, commercial design. It was commissioned in 1943 and it wasn't finished until 1959, 16 years. First of all, he took his time to ponder what a modern art museum should look like. He's going to put it in a collection of rectangular buildings, squared off, straight line buildings. So the first thing he does is decide it's going to be round. Sechrest says in her biography that of all of Wright's commissions, the Guggenheim gave Wright the most problems. This is a view of it from the interior, and this is really what sold me on it. You see, it's just a giant atrium, and it has a ramp that circles around in spiral fashion all the way to the top of the museum. And it's designed so that you can take an elevator to the top and walk the ramp down, or you can take walk the ramp up and take the elevator back down. If you notice, the modern art is against the wall. So you walk on the ramp and you look at the properly lighted artwork against a wall. It's a totally revolutionary way for a museum of art to present its art. Louis Mumford is quoted by Sechrest in the biography. He's an expert in all things architectural. He said, FLLW is the most original architect the U.S. has produced and one of the most creative architectural geniuses of all time. His radical reform of housing design with his interiors of unadorned brick and wood, his vast fireplaces and immense roofs, brought to domestic architecture the benevolent influence of the whole Romantic movement, which popularized picnics, play schools, and the virtues of living in the country. The challenges to get the Guggenheim plan approved by the family were big, And then Wright has to get them past the New York Building Authority. All of this cost time, and it also cost Wright dearly in terms of his health. During the last years of his life, while he was working on this, he developed Meniere's syndrome. Attacks from this condition bring on dizziness, nausea, vomiting, painful throbbing in the ears, loss of balance, and these symptoms can last a day. Sometimes they can last an entire month. So it was not unusual toward the end for people to go to Wright's office and find him crawling around on the floor because he had no sense of balance. He couldn't right himself up. It's interesting. He had honored Wales his entire life, and he had changed his name to honor his forebears who had come from Wales and had settled, but he'd never been there. In 1956, he took Olga and Ivana, their daughter, to Wales. It was his first and only trip back to the old country from which his mother's family had come. He went there because he was receiving one of many honorary degrees, this one from the University of Wales. 3 years later, he would be dead. His final illness and death shocked virtually everyone except Olga. He had seemed to be fine except for the Meniere's disease, and people would go and visit. He was still producing. He was still doing interesting things. On April 4th of 1959, he entered the hospital in Phoenix. 2 days later, he undergoes surgery for an abdominal obstruction, and I looked at the record, and there's no indication that there was any kind of malignancy. It was just an obstruction. And then 3 days after that, he simply dies. His story doesn't end there, though. There's a major fight ahead. Where will he be buried? He had planned it, but hadn't executed everything exactly the way he needed to because he thought he was fine. He didn't really think he was going to die really soon. And Olga had some different ideas. He died in Phoenix. His body was taken back home to his beloved Spring Green, Wisconsin, and it was buried beside Unity Chapel. This is the chapel with the two houses and the little school that he had worked on before he went to Chicago to apprentice with Sullivan. He's buried beside that chapel as he wished. It was the family chapel and burial ground. Wright had worked for the last year and a half designing a memorial to be attached to Unity Chapel. That would be where he would be buried. He intended it to be his memorial. It wasn't built, so he was buried at Unity Chapel and just left there. Then Olga died in 1985 back in Arizona. There'd been no work to build the building that Wright had meant to be built back in Spring Valley, Spring Green. Her dying wish was that Wright's remains, her daughter from her first marriage's remains, and her remains should be cremated and then buried together in a new memorial garden to be built in Scottsdale. This is where the war comes in. First of all, cremation was not what Wright had ever suggested he wanted to have done. And then he had indicated where he wanted to be buried. It's back in his home country, his Wisconsin, his beautiful Spring Green Valley. But she has other ideas. So her people who are dealing with her wills and so forth, have him cremated and take him back to Arizona, where he's not buried for several years. He just is there while they fight it out to decide what they're going to do. LeBeau writes, in his unshakable optimism, messianic zeal, and pragmatic resilience, Wright was quintessentially American. A central theme that pervades his architecture is a recurrent question in our own American culture today. How do you balance the need for individual privacy with the attraction of community activity? I love this picture of Frank Lloyd Wright. He's older here, he's wearing his tweeds. He always was a dapper dresser, always had just the right hat. And I think he is indeed the pioneer of modern architecture. His designs featured innovations unheard of in his day. The open floor plan concept, combined living and dining, radiant floor heating, floor-to-ceiling windows, skylights, interior atriums, cantilevered balconies, and at least one time a cantilevered house, carports, built-ins. But the biggest one, he oriented the homes away from the front porch onto a back patio. In 2019, 8 of Wright's buildings were added to the UNESCO World Heritage List, the first such modern architectural designation in the United States. Yep, Frank Lloyd Wright was quite a fellow.